The opening frame of this crisis lies in the recognition that Sudan is no longer facing a single catastrophe, but an overlapping collapse where war and disaster reinforce one another, creating a vortex of pressure that threatens not only the survival of its population, but the stability of its entire region. The war's militarization is no longer confined within Sudanese territory. Reports suggest flows of arms from Libya, mercenary recruitment across the Sahel, and external actors aligning with factions to secure influence in a resource-rich but collapsing state. The Red Sea, vital to global shipping, becomes a secondary arena of concern as instability in Sudan heightens the risk of spillover into Port Sudan, the country's lifeline for trade and aid. Military escalation thus not only prolongs the conflict, but widens its strategic consequences, turning Sudan from a national collapse into a potential regional flashpoint. The economic ripple effects deepen the crisis and extend beyond Sudan's borders. Domestic markets collapse as fighting cuts trade routes and inflation surges, with food prices multiplying several times over in a matter of months. Agricultural production falls as farmers abandon fields in conflict zones, while floods destroy what little harvests remain. The blockade of aid routes creates artificial scarcity, amplifying hunger in a country already on the edge of famine. Regionally, Chad and South Sudan absorb hundreds of thousands of refugees, straining food supplies and aid delivery systems. Egypt, already facing its own economic strain, sees rising pressure from refugee flows and instability along its southern frontier. Globally, Sudan's destabilization intersects with fragile supply chains for gum arabic, a commodity vital for industries ranging from food processing to pharmaceuticals, raising alarm in international markets about dependency on unstable sources. In this way, the economic ripples of Sudan's collapse extend from local bread prices to global manufacturing inputs, demonstrating how even seemingly peripheral conflicts can create shocks in global systems. Political and diplomatic pressure mounts in parallel. The African Union, the United Nations, and regional blocs attempt to broker ceasefires, yet repeated truces collapse within days as commanders on the ground ignore agreements reached in distant conference rooms. The United States, Gulf states, and European powers issue warnings, sanctions, and appeals for humanitarian corridors, but each finds itself constrained by the absence of a unified authority to negotiate with inside Sudan. External powers with competing interests, some seeking stability to protect Red Sea trade routes, others seeking influence through armed proxies, create a fragmented diplomatic field where pressure diffuses rather than concentrates. Meanwhile, humanitarian agencies sound alarms of impending famine, yet pledges of aid fall short and delivery remains blocked. The diplomatic machinery thus confronts the limits of its own credibility. Declarations of urgency collide with the inertia of fragmented interests, leaving civilians trapped between rhetorical appeals and collapsing reality. The conclusion remains open-ended, shaped by uncertainty that resists resolution. Sudan stands as a case study of compounded collapse, where war and disaster do not merely coexist but multiply one another, creating conditions that test the very limits of humanitarian capacity. The trajectory remains fragile. Military escalation could further regionalize the conflict, floods could intensify with climate shifts, and refugee flows could destabilize neighbors already under strain. Yet the international system shows no clear path to de-escalation or stabilization, underscoring the gap between global crisis management rhetoric and operational capacity. Sudan's dual collapse thus leaves a haunting question. If the world cannot contain a crisis of this magnitude in one state, what happens when similar multi-front collapses emerge elsewhere, overlapping in ways that overwhelm not just one nation but the very architecture of humanitarian response? The hook is the stark convergence. A civil war already displacing millions intersects with floods, hunger, and systemic breakdown, creating conditions where the international humanitarian system itself risks being overwhelmed. What emerges is not merely a localized crisis, but a signal of the fragility of global capacity to contain emergencies when multiple fronts collapse at once. Sudan has become the testing ground of what happens when political fragmentation, armed violence, and natural disaster do not follow in sequence, but strike simultaneously. The event description begins with the civil war between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, a conflict that ignited in April 2023 and has since fractured the country into contested zones, each controlled by rival militias and warlords who manipulate supply routes and access to aid as instruments of leverage. Khartoum, once the anchor of national administration, has devolved into a battlefield where artillery duels devastate neighborhoods and drone strikes fragment the airspace. In Darfur, long plagued by ethnic violence, reports of mass killings, targeted attacks, and forced displacement resurface with alarming frequency, echoing atrocities of 2 decades prior. As the fighting escalates, it overlays with another catastrophe: record floods that sweep through communities already shattered by war. The Nile and its tributaries overflow, displacing families who had only recently fled violence, while camps for internally displaced persons turn into swamps of disease. Cholera outbreaks follow the stagnating waters. Malnutrition deepens, and hospitals run without electricity or medicine. Together, the war and the disaster carve a map of desperation that erases the distinction between battlefield and disaster zone. The systemic vulnerability revealed is that Sudan embodies the convergence of state failure and environmental fragility in a way that outpaces the capacity of international systems to adapt. Sudan's economy was already fragile after decades of sanctions, mismanagement, and the secession of oil-rich South Sudan in 2011, which deprived Khartoum of the majority of its foreign revenue. The collapse of governance has left no central authority capable of coordinating relief or stabilizing the economy. Humanitarian organizations, already stretched thin by crises from Gaza to Ukraine to the Sahel, are unable to sustain the scale of response Sudan requires. The United Nations warns that 25 million people, half of Sudan's population, now need urgent assistance, yet access remains blocked by fighting, looting of convoys, and the deliberate targeting of aid workers. This systemic failure does not stop at borders. Sudan's collapse pushes waves of refugees into Chad, South Sudan, and Egypt, overwhelming already fragile neighbors and creating corridors of instability that stretch across the Sahel and Horn of Africa. The structural weakness lies not only in Sudan's governance, but in the capacity of regional and global systems to manage crises when multiple epicenters ignite simultaneously. The military escalation within Sudan sharpens these vulnerabilities. The Rapid Support Forces consolidate control in key urban centers, particularly in Khartoum and Darfur, leveraging external support networks for weapons and supplies. The Sudanese armed forces, meanwhile, fall back on aerial bombardments and heavy artillery, destroying civilian infrastructure in their attempt to dislodge RSF strongholds. The hook of this chapter emerges from the grim reality that Sudan's crisis is not a temporary disruption, but an entrenched condition where survival itself becomes the central battleground. Unlike conflicts that produce momentary spikes of violence or disasters that eventually recede, Sudan represents a new paradigm where war, famine, and environmental shocks intersect in a cycle with no natural exit point. The Rapid Support Forces, drawing on networks from Darfur and alleged external supplies, entrench themselves in urban centers, transforming neighborhoods into fortified positions. As the front lines stagnate, the nature of conflict becomes attritional, extending suffering indefinitely. Reports of massacres in Darfur reveal that the war has also reopened ethnic fault lines, turning the conflict into a hybrid of political struggle and communal violence. This militarization interacts with disaster in lethal ways. Flooded terrain prevents the movement of aid convoys while simultaneously offering cover for irregular fighters. Port Sudan, the last functional gateway for international operations, faces increasing strain as it becomes both a humanitarian hub and a potential military objective. With arms flows seeping across porous borders and external powers calculating their own interests in Sudan's instability, the prospect of escalation into a wider regional conflict becomes increasingly tangible. The economic ripple effects create feedback loops that entrench collapse further. Local markets disintegrate as supply routes are cut and inflation renders currency nearly worthless. The cost of bread, a staple in Sudanese diets, multiplies beyond reach for ordinary families, while imported goods vanish altogether. Farmers, already displaced by floods and violence, abandon fields, reducing harvests and ensuring that food scarcity persists long after the immediate shocks subside. Refugee flows into Chad, South Sudan, and Egypt create parallel economic crises as host communities share their already limited food, fuel, and water with newcomers. Chad's fragile economy, heavily dependent on subsistence agriculture, buckles under the pressure, while South Sudan, itself scarred by civil war, struggles to prevent destabilization in border regions. The global economy, though seemingly distant, feels the tremor as industries reliant on gum arabic, Sudan supplies the majority of the world's demand, confront the reality that conflict has cut production. The ripple is thus twofold: famine and economic ruin inside Sudan, and instability in neighboring markets and global industries that had quietly relied on Sudan's contributions. Diplomatic and political pressures intensify, but fail to produce traction. Ceasefires are declared, broken, and declared again, with each round eroding the credibility of mediators. The African Union struggles to present a unified front, while regional organizations fracture along lines of interest. Gulf powers issue statements of concern but remain cautious, calculating their roles in Red Sea security and resource access. Western governments issue sanctions and call for negotiations, yet without leverage on the ground, these measures translate into little more than symbolic pressure. Humanitarian appeals yield pledges of billions, but actual disbursement remains partial, and access routes remain blocked by armed factions who view aid as a tool of control. As the war drags on, international attention risks diversion to other crises, leaving Sudan in the shadow of more visible conflicts. The diplomatic machinery, designed for discrete conflicts or disasters, reveals its inability to adapt to a crisis that combines both simultaneously and shows no clear exit path. The conclusion to this second chapter remains unresolved, marked by the deepening entrenchment of dual collapse. Sudan illustrates the anatomy of protracted catastrophe, where neither military victory nor natural recovery is possible, and where external actors are unable to impose resolution. The war grinds on without decisive outcome, the floods and famines intensify with each passing season, and the civilian population bears the full weight of compounded pressures. The world confronts the question of sustainability. How long can humanitarian systems absorb a crisis that does not end? How long can neighbors withstand refugee flows without unraveling themselves? And how long can the global system ignore the strategic implications of collapse at the heart of the Sahel and Red Sea corridor? The sense of urgency lies in recognizing that the collapse is self-reinforcing. Violence destroys infrastructure, disaster deepens vulnerability, and the lack of governance prevents recovery, ensuring that each new shock lands on an already fractured foundation. What makes Sudan alarming is not only the magnitude of suffering, but the demonstration of what happens when systemic collapse ceases to be an event and instead becomes the baseline reality. The answers remain elusive, underscoring that Sudan's tragedy is not only a national collapse, but a warning of the limits of crisis management in an era of overlapping breakdowns. The event description captures how this baseline manifests in daily life. In Khartoum, residents navigate a landscape of rubble where marketplaces once bustled, searching for scarce supplies as clashes echo through ruined streets. Water lines are severed, electricity grids shattered, and hospitals either destroyed or commandeered by armed factions. In Darfur, displacement is no longer temporary. Entire communities live in perpetual flight, chased by gunfire, scorched fields, and encroaching floods. The Blue Nile and White Nile converge into corridors of destruction, as floodwaters inundate farmland and turn shelters into disease incubators. South Kordofan and other contested regions remain cut off entirely, where aerial bombardments and road blockades combine to erase civilian life from visibility. International agencies estimate that millions have been displaced within Sudan and over 1 million have crossed into neighboring countries, yet the figures themselves only capture fragments of the reality, as countless deaths go unrecorded and entire villages disappear without documentation. The dual collapse is not abstract. It is embodied in the hunger of children, the absence of medicine, the silence of abandoned towns. At the core lies systemic vulnerability. Sudan is the convergence point of multiple structural weaknesses that have been building for decades. Political fragility. Economic dependency and environmental precarity all coalesce into a national collapse that radiates outward. Politically, Sudan never completed its transition after the fall of Omar al-Bashir in 2019, leaving behind institutions riddled with factionalism and corruption. Economically, the loss of oil revenues after South Sudan's independence created a permanent deficit that was never resolved, leaving Sudan reliant on fragile agricultural exports and international aid. Environmentally, Sudan straddles the Sahel, a zone acutely exposed to climate extremes, where droughts and floods alternate with increasing severity. When the civil war broke out, these vulnerabilities were already active, ensuring that the eruption of conflict struck a society with no capacity to absorb shock. The collapse of governance left humanitarian organizations as the de facto providers of basic survival, yet their presence was already constrained by resource shortages and global competition for attention. In systemic terms, Sudan exposes the fragility of a world where crises no longer occur in isolation but stack upon one another, overwhelming the thin margin of resilience available to societies and aid networks alike. Military escalation continues to magnify this fragility. The Sudanese armed forces attempting to reassert control rely heavily on air power, which indiscriminately devastates civilian areas while failing to dislodge entrenched RSF positions. The hook of this third arc lies in the recognition that Sudan's collapse is no longer measured solely in national terms, but as a regional stress test, where borders blur under the weight of displacement, insecurity, and scarcity. The crisis radiates outward in concentric circles, destabilizing neighbors already brittle, straining international corridors, and threatening to turn the Sahel Horn of Africa belt into a continuum of instability. Thus, Sudan's war begins to evolve into a node of wider competition, where regional and external actors align with factions to safeguard influence, echoing patterns seen in Libya and Syria. What begins as an internal war risks transforming into a proxy battlefield, escalating both duration and regional exposure. The economic ripple effects magnify these security challenges. In Chad, local markets collapse under refugee inflows, creating shortages that fuel resentment between host populations and displaced Sudanese. In South Sudan, where humanitarian aid already sustains large parts of the population, the surge in arrivals overwhelms food distribution, driving hunger to critical levels. Egypt, struggling with inflation and debt, faces pressure on housing, food prices, and border economies. Regionally, trade corridors fracture as insecurity makes highways impassable and floods erase agricultural output. The agricultural breadbasket potential of Sudan, once considered a regional asset, turns into a deficit that drags surrounding states into deeper food insecurity. International markets take note as well, with humanitarian appeals for billions underscoring how local scarcity reverberates into global aid budgets. Sudan's collapse is not merely a national economic failure. It becomes a multiplier of scarcity across one of the world's most fragile economic belts, amplifying the global challenge of food insecurity and aid dependence. Diplomatic and political pressure expands, but grows more fragmented as multiple actors compete to define solutions. The African Union launches peace initiatives, but its credibility is strained by member states' divided loyalties. IGAD, the regional bloc, convenes talks, yet Ethiopia, Kenya, and others bring their own stakes into negotiations. Western governments emphasize humanitarian access, yet face waning political appetite to fund prolonged interventions amid competing crises in Ukraine, Gaza, and elsewhere. Gulf powers, balancing strategic concerns along the Red Sea, hesitate to unify, each pursuing bilateral arrangements rather than a collective strategy. The United Nations struggles to maintain relevance as ceasefire violations continue unabated, and Security Council divisions prevent decisive action. The net result is diplomatic paralysis, multiple tracks of negotiation without enforcement, multiple pledges of aid without delivery, and multiple actors pursuing fragmented strategies. For civilians, the effect is indistinguishable from abandonment, as declarations of concern do not translate into actual relief. The open-ended conclusion of this chapter highlights how Sudan's dual collapse has already breached its borders, embedding itself as a regional crisis with no clear containment. Refugee flows accelerate instability in Chad and South Sudan, economic pressures intensify in Egypt, and security concerns ripple along the Red Sea corridor. The trajectory remains unstable. Continued conflict could ignite proxy wars, further displacement could overwhelm fragile neighbors, and climate shocks could amplify the humanitarian toll beyond current projections. Diplomacy shows no sign of coherence, and aid systems face exhaustion. What began as a national collapse now demonstrates how systemic fragility across the Sahel and Horn of Africa ensures that crises do not stay contained. Sudan's trajectory thus raises the broader question: if one state's implosion can destabilize half a region, what happens when multiple collapses intersect across fragile belts worldwide? What makes the Sudanese case distinct is that its implosion is not contained within its borders, nor does it manifest in linear progression. Instead, it spreads laterally into neighboring systems, multiplying vulnerabilities that converge at the regional level. Sudan becomes the epicenter of a destabilization chain that tests whether fragile states in its periphery can withstand prolonged exposure to collapse. The event description begins with the refugee flows that pour across borders at unprecedented speed. In Chad, over 1 million Sudanese refugees arrive in waves, overwhelming camps designed for tens of thousands. The Chadian state, itself contending with poverty, desertification, and its own insurgent threats, finds its institutions unable to provide even minimal services. In South Sudan, which only a decade ago emerged from its own civil war, the influx of Sudanese refugees collides with internal displacement from ongoing intercommunal violence, producing humanitarian needs that dwarf existing aid capacity. Egypt, facing economic crisis and political stress, becomes a destination of last resort, with hundreds of thousands of Sudanese arriving in border towns where infrastructure is collapsing. These movements create demographic shifts that destabilize local economies, aggravate ethnic tensions, and accelerate competition over resources. The crisis is not only about numbers. It is about how displacement cascades into border disputes, insurgencies, and breakdowns in governance across an already fragile belt. Systemic vulnerability at the regional level is thus exposed in stark relief. The Sahel and Horn of Africa are among the most climate-stressed and conflict-ridden regions on Earth, and Sudan's collapse inserts additional weight into a system already close to breaking. Chad faces the dual threat of militant insurgencies in its north and agricultural collapse in its south. South Sudan contends with chronic flooding and fragile peace agreements that threaten to unravel under external strain. Ethiopia, recovering from the Tigray conflict, watches instability on its border with apprehension, fearing renewed insurgency in its own peripheries. The Red Sea corridor, vital for global trade, becomes more volatile as Port Sudan and its supply lines face militarization risks. The systemic vulnerability is clear. When one state collapses in this belt, its neighbors lack the capacity to absorb the shock, ensuring that instability propagates rather than dissipates. Sudan is not an isolated failure. It is a trigger for regional unraveling. The military escalation dimension reflects how external actors are drawn into the conflict, deliberately or by necessity. Reports indicate that armed groups from neighboring states exploit porous borders to supply weapons and fighters to Sudanese factions, turning the conflict into a transnational struggle. Libyan militias funnel arms south, while mercenary networks extend recruitment across the Sahel. Eritrea and Ethiopia position themselves cautiously, aware that Sudan's instability threatens their strategic interests. Egypt, historically invested in Sudan as part of its Nile water security strategy, contemplates deeper involvement as instability grows along its southern frontier. Gulf states monitor closely, aware that Red Sea instability has direct implications for maritime security, oil flows, and their own investments. The hook of this fourth arc is the sobering recognition that Sudan's collapse is not only a humanitarian emergency and a regional destabilizer, but also a structural challenge to the global humanitarian system itself. What makes Sudan's crisis distinct is not only the depth of suffering, but the way it reveals systemic limits in the international capacity to respond when multiple mega-crises converge. Humanitarian aid becomes the sole functioning economic injection, but its insufficiency means widespread scarcity. Refugees crossing into Chad, South Sudan, and Egypt impose parallel burdens on host economies already struggling with inflation, food insecurity, and unemployment. At the global level, the cost of sustaining simultaneous large-scale humanitarian operations stretches donor budgets thin, with aid agencies warning of insolvency. Sudan thus magnifies a wider pattern. As each new mega-crisis demands billions in relief, the global financial base for humanitarian aid erodes, leaving systemic underfunding as the new normal. The ripple is no longer just about scarcity inside Sudan, but about the global financial exhaustion that Sudan accelerates. Diplomatic and political pressure grows heavier, but no more effective. The African Union and regional actors attempt mediation, yet each ceasefire collapses within days. The United Nations Security Council remains divided, with competing geopolitical priorities diluting consensus. Western governments issue sanctions and condemnations, but these do little to influence the ground where commanders act autonomously and warlords benefit from continued chaos. Gulf states hold strategic leverage through influence in the Red Sea corridor, but pursue fragmented interests rather than unified strategies. Humanitarian corridors remain hostage to factional negotiation, and appeals for protection of civilians go unanswered. The political machinery that once aimed to de-escalate conflicts through pressure and mediation now confronts an environment where non-state actors, fragmented command structures, and external meddling dilute its efficacy. Sudan's collapse therefore reveals not only a humanitarian crisis, but a crisis of global governance itself. The open-ended conclusion of this fourth arc underscores the global implications of Sudan's dual collapse. The world faces not only the challenge of containing Sudan's tragedy, but the recognition that similar compounded crises may soon emerge elsewhere, in states where conflict, climate, and governance fragility intersect. The question is no longer whether the international system can manage Sudan, but whether the system itself is sustainable in a world where crises multiply and overlap. Sudan stands as the prototype of humanitarian overextension, the point where need exceeds capacity and where declarations of solidarity prove inadequate against structural exhaustion. The uncertainty that hangs over Sudan is not only about whether its war will end or its floods recede, but about whether the world has the tools to respond when multiple Sudans emerge simultaneously. The answer remains unresolved, leaving Sudan both a tragedy of the present and a warning for the future. The world is already stretched thin by simultaneous emergencies in Gaza, Ukraine, Yemen, Haiti, and across the Sahel. Sudan's dual collapse therefore arrives not in isolation but in a crowded landscape of need, where donor fatigue, logistical strain, and political paralysis converge. The core tension is that Sudan demands a scale of intervention the world can no longer guarantee, exposing a future in which humanitarian collapse may outpace the capacity for relief. The event description illustrates this strain in operational terms. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs declares Sudan the site of the world's largest displacement crisis, with nearly 10 million uprooted from their homes. Yet funding appeals remain less than half met, leaving programs to feed millions curtailed or suspended. Aid convoys are looted or blocked at checkpoints, while humanitarian workers are targeted by armed groups or forced to evacuate under fire. Port Sudan, the sole operational lifeline, functions at the brink of overload as aid must flow through a single fragile corridor. Medical facilities collapse as supply chains break, leaving hospitals to operate without anesthetics, antibiotics, or power. The sheer scale of unmet need demonstrates that this is not simply a matter of more funding or more coordination. Sudan's dual collapse has outstripped the international system's ability to deliver relief under hostile and fragmented conditions. It is a test not of charity, but of structural capacity. Systemic vulnerability within the humanitarian architecture becomes visible in Sudan's case. International aid is built on assumptions of temporary disruption and partial access. Sudan defies these assumptions by presenting both a protracted conflict and an environmental catastrophe across an entire state. The global aid system is also premised on donor consistency, yet the convergence of crises has thinned financial support as governments in Europe and North America divert resources toward Ukraine and domestic economic pressures. Sudan highlights the fragility of logistics, where aid relies on vulnerable corridors, few operational ports, and limited aerial supply. The targeting of aid workers, over 100 killed since the conflict began, further erodes operational capacity. These vulnerabilities expose the structural truth. The global humanitarian system was never designed for a world of overlapping mega-crises, and Sudan illustrates what happens when demands exceed the system's elasticity. Humanitarian collapse becomes systemic, not incidental. The military escalation dimension adds another layer of risk to humanitarian limits. The Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces both view aid as leverage, using access and denial as tools of war. Convoys are taxed, diverted, or blocked entirely, with civilians left in limbo. Armed groups infiltrate camps for the displaced, using them as recruitment grounds or shielded bases. The risk of foreign mercenaries and external actors supporting rival factions further militarizes the aid environment, making neutrality nearly impossible. Military clashes near Port Sudan raise fears that the last functional humanitarian artery could be severed, leaving millions without lifelines. The longer the conflict persists, the more entrenched these dynamics become, ensuring that aid remains not a neutral good, but a contested prize within the battlefield logic of both factions. In this sense, military escalation directly translates into humanitarian strangulation. Economic ripple effects deepen the humanitarian shortfall. Sudan's internal economy is destroyed, with markets paralyzed, banking systems collapsed, and inflation rendering the local currency nearly valueless. The hook of the final arc is the realization that Sudan has become a mirror for the 21st century's defining dilemma. A world in which crises are not sequential but simultaneous, not local but interconnected, not temporary but structural. In Sudan, escalation has no climax, only continuation. The economic ripple effects reinforce this entrenchment. Inside Sudan, agricultural collapse drives famine conditions, with the World Food Program warning that millions face catastrophic hunger. Inflation erodes whatever remains of local purchasing power, while looted markets and destroyed infrastructure prevent any semblance of recovery. For neighboring states, the cost of absorbing refugees pushes fragile economies to the brink, creating cycles of scarcity that inflame local tensions. At the global level, the financial burden of sustaining humanitarian operations in Sudan compounds already overstretched budgets, creating a zero-sum dynamic where aid to Sudan reduces capacity elsewhere. The ripple is recursive. Economic collapse inside Sudan generates humanitarian demand, which in turn accelerates global financial strain, which then limits the ability to meet Sudan's needs, deepening collapse further. Sudan illustrates not only localized economic ruin, but the feedback loops that bind fragile economies to global humanitarian sustainability. Political and diplomatic pressure escalates, but without breakthrough. The African Union's mediation attempts falter as ceasefires collapse within days. IGAD's initiatives stall amid competing national interests of Ethiopia, Kenya, and others. Western governments oscillate between sanctions, condemnation, and humanitarian pledges, yet without leverage inside Sudan, their influence remains symbolic. Gulf powers, strategically positioned to shape outcomes through Red Sea leverage and financial capacity, pursue divergent bilateral strategies that dilute collective pressure. The United Nations, constrained by Security Council divisions, issues urgent appeals, yet finds itself sidelined by realities on the ground. The net result is paralysis. Multiple actors pursuing fragmented strategies, while neither faction inside Sudan yields ground. Diplomacy becomes a theater of statements rather than solutions, exposing a crisis of political will as acute as the crisis of governance inside Sudan itself. The open-ended conclusion underscores that Sudan's trajectory remains unresolved, not because solutions are absent, but because the global system lacks the capacity to enforce them. The war shows no sign of abating, the floods no sign of receding, the famine no sign of easing. Refugees continue to cross borders, neighbors continue to strain, and the global aid system continues to fray. Sudan stands as both a humanitarian emergency and a structural warning. The world is entering an era where multiple collapses overlap, where crises no longer allow pause between them. and where the international architecture designed to prevent breakdown risks becoming the first casualty of systemic overload. The final question Sudan forces onto the global stage is not simply whether this country can be saved, but whether the international system can survive an age defined by simultaneous collapses. The answer remains uncertain, leaving Sudan not only as a site of tragedy, but as the frontier of global fragility. The dual collapse of civil war and disaster inside Sudan has pushed humanitarian limits to their breaking point, and in doing so, it has revealed that the boundaries of crisis management are no longer set by geography or mandate, but by systemic exhaustion. Sudan is not only a national emergency, it is a lens into what happens when conflict, climate, and governance fail converge, and when the very architecture designed to prevent collapse finds itself overrun. The event description shows the deepening layers of this collapse. In Khartoum, the capital remains fragmented by shifting battle lines, where neighborhoods that once hosted universities, markets, and ministries now lie in ruins. In Darfur, massacres and ethnic cleansing recur with haunting familiarity, evoking the darkest chapters of the early 2000s. In South Kordofan and Blue Nile states, civilians are cut off entirely, living in isolated pockets without food or medicine. Meanwhile, floodwaters displace hundreds of thousands more, pushing the displaced into already overcrowded camps where cholera, malaria, and malnutrition thrive. The International Organization for Migration estimates that 1 in 5 Sudanese has been displaced, a figure that captures scale but cannot fully convey the human weight of collapsed livelihoods, abandoned homes, and communities erased. Sudan is no longer in crisis. Sudan is crisis itself, a territory defined by the collapse of basic functions of survival. Systemic vulnerability lies in the way this collapse resonates beyond Sudan's borders. The Horn of Africa and Sahel Belt is already marked by governance fragility, insurgencies, and climate volatility. Sudan's collapse compounds this landscape, creating a corridor of instability that stretches from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea. Food insecurity ripples into Chad and South Sudan, refugee inflows pressure Egypt and Ethiopia, and Red Sea security becomes entangled in the volatility of Port Sudan. Beyond Africa, global aid budgets are drained, donor fatigue sets in, and industries dependent on Sudan's gum arabic confront supply disruption. The systemic truth is stark. Sudan demonstrates that the collapse of one state, when combined with environmental disaster, can destabilize entire regional architectures and test global systems, already under strain from overlapping emergencies elsewhere. Vulnerability is no longer confined, it is networked. Military escalation persists, prolonging and amplifying this fragility. Neither the Sudanese armed forces nor the rapid support forces achieves decisive advantage, yet both continue to escalate through bombardments, drone strikes, and urban warfare. As the front lines stagnate, the war assumes an attritional character where civilians bear the cost. Arms flows from Libya, mercenary recruitment across the Sahel, and external patronage ensure that the war remains supplied. Meanwhile, the militarization of humanitarian corridors transforms aid into another theater of contest, where convoys are taxed, diverted, or attacked. Port Sudan remains precarious, the singular artery for both humanitarian relief and external trade, vulnerable to both blockade and military strike. The war therefore evolves into a long-term condition, entrenching instability while increasing the probability of externalization into proxy conflicts.